What started as a peaceful trip to Israel quickly spiraled into something no one saw coming. Joni and Doug's journey took a dramatic twist that sent shockwaves through everyone around them. In a stunning turn of events, Jonathan and Suzy were blindsided by a revelation that left them speechless. The calm was shattered by news so unexpected, it changed everything. What was meant to be a spiritual journey turned into a moment of truth. You won't believe what was revealed on this trip. While cameras followed Jonilamb and Doug Weiss through the streets of Israel, smiling, shaking hands, and making headlines, something entirely different was happening miles away. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't scripted, and it wasn't planned by any media team. In fact, no one saw it coming. But in a quiet corner of Jerusalem, at one of the most sacred places in the world, God was writing a moment that would speak louder than any broadcast ever could. Rose Howard, a longtime family friend, was also in Israel at the time. She wasn't there for a public event or a major ministry tour. She was simply there to pray. Like so many before her, she found herself standing at the Western Wall, the ancient stones where people come from all over the world to pour out their hearts, leave written prayers, and cry out to God. And in that moment, she did something small but powerful. She wrote down the names of Jonathan and Suzy Lamb, slipped the folded paper into one of the cracks, and prayed over them. No lights, no stage, just faith. Back in Montana, it was a normal morning. Suzy picked up her phone and saw the message from Rose. Just a photo, just a few words, but it hit her like a wave. As she looked at that image, their names tucked into the same wall where she and Jonathan had once prayed years ago, her heart overflowed. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was deeply holy. It was like God was whispering, "I still see you. I haven't forgotten." For Suzy, that moment was more than just a kind gesture. It brought her back to a different time. A memory from 2017, when she and Jonathan visited Israel together, early in their marriage. She had been 4 months pregnant with their son. Jonathan had written a covenant prayer at the Western Wall back then, asking God to lead his life and keep him in his will. That moment had marked something deep in their walk with God. And now, years later, in a completely unexpected way, their names were back in that same wall. A full circle, a divine echo. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't random timing. It was personal, intimate, God-sized. While the world watched Joni and Doug's trip unfold on social media, heaven was orchestrating a sacred reminder in the background that the lambs who had stepped away from the spotlight were not forgotten. Not by God, not by those who truly loved them. That prayer, in the cracks of the wall, was more than symbolic. It was a spark, a shift, a soft, holy moment no one expected, except maybe God. Leaving Daystar wasn't just a job change for Jonathan and Suzy Lamb. It wasn't something they planned, and it certainly wasn't something they ever imagined would end the way it did. For most people watching from the outside, it looked sudden. One day they were there, on air, smiling, part of the ministry, and the next, they were gone. No farewell, no official announcement, no blessing. Just silence, but behind that silence was a deep breaking point that had been building for a long time. Jonathan wasn't just an employee at Daystar, he was born into it. He was the son of Marcus and Joni Lamb, the founders of the network. He grew up around cameras, in studio hallways, behind the scenes of global broadcasts. The ministry wasn't just a place he worked, it was in his DNA. He believed in it. He believed in the mission, in the people, in what it stood for. And Suzy, just as passionate and devoted, had stepped into the world of Daystar with the same hope and purpose: to serve, to love, to spread the gospel. At first, everything seemed right. They had influence, a respected name, and a place at the table. But over time, things started to feel different. There were conversations that felt less like collaboration and more like control. Decisions that didn't make sense. A growing sense that speaking up or even asking questions was dangerous. They noticed a shift in the culture. Less grace, more pressure. Less dialogue, more silence. Jonathan especially began to feel it. As a son, he was expected to carry the legacy. But as a man of conviction, he couldn't ignore the tension growing inside. One moment, in particular, stands out. It was the day he was handed a prepared comment to read live on air. It was a glowing endorsement of Joni Lamb's recent marriage to Doug Weiss. A marriage that had already sparked a wave of confusion and controversy in Christian circles. Jonathan knew the comment wasn't from his heart. It felt forced, like he was being used to send a message he didn't believe in. And so, he did what very few in his position would have done. He said no. He refused to read it. That small act of quiet conviction sent shockwaves behind the scenes. It wasn't just seen as disobedience, it was seen as betrayal. From that moment on, everything changed. The warmth turned cold, the support disappeared, and soon after both he and Suzy were removed from their roles. There was no explanation, no conversation, they were just out. For a ministry that preached grace, the way they were treated was anything but. But the hardest part wasn't losing their titles or their platform, it was losing the relationships they had poured their hearts into. Friends they had known for years suddenly stopped returning calls. People they once prayed with now avoided them. The silence was loud, and the rejection ran deep. It didn't feel like a resignation, it felt like exile. What followed was one of the darkest seasons of their lives. There were rumors, whispers, judgments from people who didn't know the full story. And because they chose not to fight back publicly, many assumed the worst. But inside, Jonathan and Suzy were trying to make sense of what had just happened. They were grieving, not just for what they lost, but for the realization that the place they had called home had become unsafe. Spiritually, emotionally, even physically, they were worn down. They knew they had to get out, not just out of the spotlight, but out of the atmosphere. So they packed up their life in Texas and moved to Montana. Not for a new opportunity, not to start a new ministry, just to breathe, just to survive. Montana became their refuge, a place with no cameras, no pressure, no performance, just mountains, stillness, and space to process. In those first few weeks, there were no grand plans, just long walks, quiet mornings, tears, deep conversations. They found a local church, not one that cared about their last name, but one that cared about their hearts. For the first time in years, they sat in a congregation as just people, not leaders, not guests, just Jonathan and Suzy. Two people who had been through hell and were trying to find God in the aftermath. And they did, not through sermons or spotlights, but through the silence, through the simple rhythm of rest and prayer and healing. They didn't talk about launching a platform or creating something new. They talked about being present, about raising their kids in peace, about letting God be enough again. Over time, they started sharing bits and pieces online, not statements or defenses, just raw, honest reflections. Scriptures that were helping them, thoughts on what it means to trust God when everything feels broken. Their words weren't polished, but they were real. And that's what drew people in. Because in a world full of religious noise and performance, Jonathan and Suzy were living proof that it's okay to step away, that it's okay to not be okay, that sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is rest and let God rebuild you quietly. But none of this came easily. There were days of doubt, nights filled with questions, moments of deep sadness. Losing something you gave your life to hurts in ways you can't explain. And they weren't just dealing with disappointment, they were dealing with spiritual trauma. The kind that doesn't leave bruises on your body, but on your soul. The kind that makes you question everything, your calling, your worth, your voice. Still, they chose not to grow bitter. They chose not to lash out. They didn't go online to call people out or name names. Instead, they just told the truth, gently, humbly, in time. And when they did, it resonated. Because their story wasn't just their own. It was the story of so many others who had been hurt by the church or pushed out of ministries they loved. People who had experienced control masked as leadership, silence disguised as unity, pressure that looked like honor. Their story gave those people language. It gave them hope. Now, when people look at Jonathan and Suzy, they don't just see a couple who left Daystar. They see two people who survived a deep breaking and chose healing instead of revenge. They see a couple who lost everything familiar, but found something even greater. Peace, freedom, and a deeper walk with God. Leaving Daystar wasn't a clean break, it was messy, painful, and it cost them more than most people will ever know. But looking back, they know it was necessary, because sometimes God calls you out of a place, not to punish you, but to protect you. Sometimes He has to tear down what's been built on shaky ground so He can rebuild something stronger, something that actually reflects His heart. And that's what's happening now. Their breaking point became their turning point. And while the world may still have questions, Jonathan and Suzy have found their answer. God is still good. He still leads, and even in the most painful exits, He can bring new beginnings. The stage may have been taken from them, but the story isn't over. Not even close. When Jonathan and Suzy Lamb packed up their lives in Texas and moved to Montana, they weren't chasing a new dream or building some secret project. They were simply trying to breathe. After everything they'd been through, leaving Daystar, losing relationships, and walking away from the ministry they had poured their hearts into, they were exhausted. Not just physically, spiritually, emotionally, deeply. Montana wasn't chosen for strategy. It was chosen for survival. Somewhere quiet, somewhere far, somewhere without cameras, pressure, or people asking questions they weren't ready to answer. They didn't arrive with a plan. They didn't arrive with confidence. They arrived carrying pain, confusion, and a desperate need to be still. The first few weeks were strange. Quiet mornings replaced the usual rush of meetings and schedules. No studio lights, no microphones, no ministry deadlines. Just the sound of wind through trees and the silence of snow-covered hills. And slowly, in that silence, they began to heal. It wasn't dramatic. There were no big revelations, just small, daily moments of peace. Waking up to the stillness, drinking coffee without rushing out the door, taking long walks, watching their kids play in wide-open space. It felt foreign at first. Too simple, too still. But over time, it became familiar. Safe, holy, even. They found a local church, not a big polished one, but a small gathering of people who didn't care about their last name. There were no special introductions, no expectations to lead or speak. They were just Jonathan and Suzy, two people who needed Jesus like everyone else in the room. And that, more than anything, gave them room to exhale. For the first time in a long time, they could just sit and worship without performing. They didn't have to be strong for others. They didn't have to pretend. They didn't have to lead. They could just be. And in that simple, sacred space, God began to restore what had been broken. Some days were still heavy. The weight of what they'd left behind didn't just disappear. There were tears. There were moments when memories hit hard. Things said, things left unsaid. But there was also laughter. There were bonfires, kids' soccer games, late-night prayers whispered in bed. It was a quiet, steady rebuilding. One that didn't make headlines but mattered more than any platform ever could. They didn't rush into anything new. No big ministry launch. No comeback plan. They weren't interested in proving anything to anyone. Instead, they leaned into rest. They let God speak to places in their hearts that had been wounded. They let the silence teach them things the stage never could. Things about trust, about identity, about letting go of needing to be needed. Eventually, they started to share small pieces of their journey online, not with big announcements or dramatic statements, just honest reflections. A verse that helped them that day, a thought about what it means to follow Jesus when everything feels uncertain, a reminder that healing is slow but sacred. Their posts weren't curated or polished. They were real, raw. And that's why people connected with them, because their story wasn't some perfect testimony tied up with a bow. It was ongoing. It still is. People began to watch not because they were flashy, but because they were honest. In a world filled with noise, Jonathan and Suzy were offering quiet truth. Not performative, not forced, just simple faith from two people who had walked through fire and still believed God was good. And in all of it, they rediscovered the beauty of small things. Family dinners, watching the sunset, praying together without cameras rolling. Ministry became less about stages and more about serving their kids, loving their neighbors, and being present in the moment. They didn't need a building to be ministers. They didn't need applause to feel valuable. They just needed God. And each other. In Montana, they found a slower pace, a quieter life. But within that quiet, they found strength. Not the kind that comes from pushing through pain, but the kind that comes from letting God hold it with you. They realized healing isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about learning how to carry it differently. With grace, with hope, without bitterness. They could have disappeared completely and no one would have blamed them. They had every reason to walk away from ministry for good. But they didn't. Instead, they chose to be still, to listen, to heal. And slowly, God began to put the pieces back together. Not the way they expected, not the way the world might have scripted it, but in a deeper, stronger, more honest way. Their time in Montana hasn't been about running from their past, it's been about rebuilding their future, on a firmer foundation. One not built on performance or pressure, but on presence and peace. Day by day, step by step. And though the cameras are gone and the spotlight has dimmed, something far more powerful is taking root. Something real. Something eternal. This new way of living isn't about being famous, it's about being faithful. And in the quiet of the mountains, Jonathan and Suzy Lamb have discovered that sometimes the most powerful ministry is the one no one sees, but heaven notices. And in that place, they are being made whole again. There's something in the air, something you can't fully explain, but you can feel it. The kind of shift that doesn't come with headlines or press releases, but with quiet moments, small signs and whispers in the spirit. For those who've been watching Jonathan and Suzy Lamb closely, it's clear, a new chapter is coming. No one knows exactly when or how, but it's there. Growing like a seed just beneath the surface, waiting for the right time to break through. It started with small things, a few posts, a quiet re-emergence online, a sense of calm in their words, even though you knew they had walked through fire. They weren't preaching, they weren't announcing some grand return, they were just living honestly, faithfully, day by day. But in between the lines, people started to notice. There was something building, something bigger than them, something that didn't look like the past, but felt like the future. And then came that one moment that seemed to confirm it all. While Joni Lamb and Doug Weiss were walking the streets of Israel, meeting with leaders, posing for photos, and representing Daystar in front of the world, a friend of the Lamb family, Rose Howard, was also in Israel. But unlike the public tour Joni and Doug were on, Rose's trip was quiet, personal, and spiritual. She visited the Western Wall, one of the holiest places on earth, and while standing there, she wrote down two names, Jonathan and Suzy Lamb, and tucked the paper into the cracks of the ancient stone. She prayed over them right there in Jerusalem, asking God to move, to heal, to restore. That photo of their names in the wall made its way to Montana, and when Suzy saw it, something inside her shifted. It wasn't just a sweet gesture, it was confirmation, a divine nudge. At the exact moment that the ministry they had left behind was walking the streets of Israel, their names were being spoken in prayer on the same soil. It wasn't orchestrated, it wasn't coordinated, it was God. And everyone who saw it knew it. That moment was more than touching, it was prophetic, because you can't write a story like that. You can't plan timing that perfect. It was as if God himself was saying, I haven't forgotten you. I still have plans for you. And not just any plans, but something new, something no man or system could control, something that wasn't built by platform, but by purpose. For Jonathan and Suzy, it was another thread in a story that God had been quietly weaving since they left Daystar. They didn't know what would come next. They weren't out trying to build a new empire. But their hearts stayed soft, their faith stayed strong, and now, finally, it feels like something is shifting. Something is being prepared behind the scenes. And the truth is, it makes sense. Jonathan Lamb wasn't just any voice in Christian media. He was born into ministry. He grew up watching his parents build something from nothing. He saw the weight of leadership, the cost of faithfulness, and the pressure of legacy. But he also saw the cracks, the control, the quiet hurt. And walking away wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And yet, even in his absence, there's a growing sense that Jonathan's story in ministry isn't over. In fact, it might just be getting started. Not as someone else's shadow, not under the weight of someone else's vision, but as his own man. A man of God, shaped not by platforms, but by pain, humility, and healing. Suzy too has stepped into her voice in a new way. Through all the chaos, she never lashed out. She never let bitterness lead her story. She simply kept speaking truth with grace. She stood beside her husband, she raised her kids, and she stayed faithful in the middle of heartbreak. Now, her strength isn't just quiet, it's powerful. She's not looking for attention. But people can't help but notice her courage, her steadiness, her faith. Together they've become something rare. A couple who walked away from everything and came out stronger. Not louder, not flashier, but more rooted, more refined. And in a world that's tired of performance, that kind of authenticity is exactly what people are longing for. So now, people are watching not out of gossip or curiosity, but because hope is contagious. People who have been hurt by ministry, who have lost trust in leadership, who've felt burned by church politics, they're seeing something different in Jonathan and Suzy. They're seeing what happens when people choose faithfulness over fame, healing over platform, God's timing over personal ambition. And no, Jonathan and Suzy haven't said much. They haven't launched anything new. They haven't made a big return. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the new chapter doesn't need a press release. Maybe it doesn't need marketing. Maybe it just needs God to say, it's time. Because if you look closely, you'll see the signs. In their peace, in their consistency, in the way they carry themselves. They've been through too much to fake it now. And they're not. What you see is who they are. And that, more than anything, is what makes people believe that what's coming next won't be about reclaiming old titles. It'll be about stepping into new purpose. There's a sense among many that something is stirring not just for them, but through them. That God is preparing a platform not made by man, but by His hand alone. A platform not built on a network's name, but on Jesus' name. One that won't be about performance or control, but healing, truth, and freedom. And maybe that's why the Western Wall moment hit so deeply. Because it reminded everyone watching that Jonathan and Suzy haven't been forgotten. Their calling hasn't been canceled. It's been refined. And now the time for hiding is slowly turning into a time for rising. They didn't choose this road, but they've walked it with integrity. And that's why people are watching. Not because they expect a show, but because they believe in the story. Because they know what happens when God writes the next chapter. It's never what you expect, but it's always exactly what's needed. And maybe, just maybe, that chapter is closer than we think.